I want to thank everyone for coming to the Metro Archives First Tuesday. Today, on our February 1st Tuesday, we have Betsy Thorpe. She's done a lot of research on the train wreck at Dutchmans Curve, and probably a lot of you know it was in 1918 here in Nashville, and it's still the worst train disaster in the United States. And so I'm pleased to have her here today to talk about that. She will be available for book signing after her presentation. And so if please hang around, and we have some books from the library that you could check out if you're interested in such things. So with no further, I will turn it over to Betsy.
Thank you, Ken. Before I get started, do you guys care if I take a picture of y'all?
What you do, selfie? Let us see.
I forgot my cell phone today of all days. I had to go buy a camera. All right, you get a picture for me, Mary.
This is my assistant.
Yeah. No, the long way. All right. I could have already had it done. All right, thank you, Mary. Now go sit back down.
Now we have to sign them off the releases.
Right. Facebook releases, right? Well, my name is Betsy Thorpe, and I'm here today to talk to you about my book, The Day the Whistles Cried. But before I start talking to you about my book, I want to talk to you a little bit about another transportation disaster that happened 58 years ago today. It was the day the music died. Buddy Holly, they all went down in a plane crash today. And so when my friend Terry Coates here came up with the title for my book, none of the ones I came up with met his satisfaction. And he kept saying, why don't you name it something like The Day the Whistles Cried? So eventually I was like, can I just take that name? And I said he channeled his inner Don McLean. So I just wanted to kind of mention today is the anniversary of, and I don't know is there anybody in here old enough to remember when that happened? Joel, Dave, Ralkin, okay, all right. It was kind of it was a sad day. So anyway, I just thought about that with it being with the titles of that song and my book being so similar. So my book, The Day the Whistles Cried, is about the worst train wreck in U.S. history. It happened in Nashville near the intersection of White Bridge Road and Harding Road in 1918. And it remains today to be, as Ken said, the worst train wreck in U.S. history. More than 100 people were killed. And today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that caused it to be such a deadly crash. But before we do that, I've never done a PowerPoint before, so y'all bear with me. My very first book signing was on July 8th, 2015. I work at Shoney's in Bellevue, and they hosted a book signing for me a couple days after I picked up the first copies of my book, and that's what it looked like. So, and there's a historical marker on White Bridge Road near the Harding Road. It's at the entrance to the Greenway, and we commemorated that marker on the 90th anniversary of the train wreck, which was July 9th, 2018. For those of you who were there for that commemoration, you will recall it rained really hard that day. This picture was actually taken the day before. It has her older sister, my middle granddaughter. That's my mom, who took a train all the way out from Oregon to be here for that event. My friend Kim, who helped me research it. And the two people standing at the end, one was from California, one was from Washington, D.C. They are Nolans. They're the grandchildren of one of the people who was killed in the train wreck, John Nolan. He was the engineer who was on the train. He was off duty, and he was riding it so he could bring it back from Memphis the next day. And here's another picture of the marker. And I like this picture because as I was talking to this gentleman earlier today, a few minutes ago, it really shows how the landscape has changed since 1918. When the old White Bridge was erected in 1918, It was like there was nothing out, nothing on the landscape. People could see it from miles away. They say it blinded them in the sunlight. You know when you're driving up White Bridge Road and you know how the sun's going down, how bright it is? Well, they said it was blinding when the sun would hit the white concrete of the bridge. And now there's so many buildings and things around there that it's just hard to locate the bridge, even though it's just right there. Another thing about this marker that really leads into what I want to talk about today is, if you'll read it, it says, over 100 died, including many African American workers journeying to work at the munitions plant near Old Hickory. Now, when I first heard about the story, there was always that sentence, over 80% of them were black workers. I wanted to know, why was that? Why was 80% of the people who were killed in that train wreck, why were they black? What caused that number to be that way? So when I started researching, I had to go back to a time before the train wreck and come up with some some things that happened that led to that event. In 1896, the Supreme Court, in a famous ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, ruled that it was legal to offer separate but equal accommodations on a train for black and white passengers. Separate but equal did not really equal what it sounds. It was separate, but it really wasn't equal, because how can it be equal when the black passenger's car, which was called the Jim Crow car, was at the very front of the train, which was the most uncomfortable, had the most smoke coming into their car, was in the most dangerous position should there be an accident, because they were very close to the locomotive. So it was that particular circumstance that caused it to be 80% of the people who were killed were African American. It was because of that law. I think the trains were all both made of wood, so in this situation, that many people would have died regardless. But tilting the scales of racial equality, there would have been, if people were just dispersed among the trains equally, there would not have been that greater number of black people killed. When I did this PowerPoint, somehow I got the one didn't crop onto it wasn't 21 persons are killed, it said 121 persons are killed. And a gentleman named Henry Hill, who was a photographer for the NC&C&L Railway, took a photograph of this newspaper, and it was in his collection of photographs. And this was from the Tennessean the day after the wreck. And this picture right here, that would be one of his photographs, I'm sure. I'm sure he took that photograph, because he took a lot of photographs of the wreck the day that it happened. Of the African American people who were killed, I know very little about most of them. What I do know about most of them, I gleaned from information that was on their death certificates, their age, their names, where they were from, what their occupations were. This gentleman, Mr. George Hall, I happen to know quite a bit about, because he was a Nashville resident. He was a pretty prominent person in the African American community. He lived right on the corner of 16th and Jackson, like in the shadow of Fisk University, which was like the really good segregated neighborhood. And so the Nashville Globe did 2 big articles about him following the accident. So I was able to actually find a picture of him. This was taken from the Nashville Globe, and I learned a lot about what kind of person he was. He was a commander in the Colored Knights of Pythias, which was a large group, one of the secret societies like the Masons, the Knights of Pythias, I think, were one of the more powerful organizations, and he was a leader in the African American era of it. His children had all graduated from high school, which was quite a feat, and I think one of them was going, if my research is correct, one of them was enrolled at Fisk University. They also graduated up in the 8th grade from Fisk. That's where a lot of children went to school there for their elementary school, and he was really well respected, and he was a powerful person in his community, but he had like a very demeaning job on the train. It was his job to see to the needs of, he was just like a servant on the train, and he saw to the needs of the people who were riding in what they called the regular coaches. But I was very happy to have a photograph of him, because it kind of gives a face to the 80%. We have photos of quite a few of the other people, but this is the only one from that 80%. This picture was taken it's a view of the train wreck. I think it was probably taken around noon that day, about 4 hours after the wreck happened. You can see the wrecker train, what would you call it, wrecker locomotive, steam wrecker? And it had come from Nashville, and it was like taking one by one, it took the cars back to the shops to either be repaired or replaced. And these cars would have been the sleeper cars from the overnight train from Memphis, if I've got that correct. I get kind of confused on what the cars were and where the trains were, but as well as I can understand, they've already taken most of the outbound train back to the shops, and they're coming to get the trains from the inbound train. We're very fortunate to have Mr. Hill's photographs.
The two more front there are on the national train, going toward the national train.
I don't know how to go back. There's got to be a way. This was not one of Mr. Hill's photographs. I don't know who took this photograph. Someone found these found 7 photos in the attic of someone's estate and donated them to the Nashville room. So this shows how all these different, you can just see the kind, some of these would be passengers, some of these would be people that had come in from Nashville, some from the neighborhood, and they're all working together to pull people out of these that were trapped in these cars. So this would have been taken pretty early in the day. I call this photograph hoping to find loved ones. I don't know for sure that's what these people are doing, but I see all these cots. They're clean, they're white. It kind of makes me sad because they've got them lined up and there was probably no live bodies to put on them. That's what I see in this photograph. And all these people milling around, and they're just, because people came out and they were identifying people and taking them home. Things that we would never be allowed to do today.
Were there survivors?
Oh, there was way more survivors than there were. Yeah. So some of these people were probably people who were, on the train that weren't injured too. So I think there was probably at least 600 people on each train, and because there was 5 cars. And they were packed full, so there would have been, so a lot of people were injured, then there was a severely injured, then there was a killed, and then there was the further back you were on the train, there were no white women or children killed or injured. Or I'll just say there's no record of any white women or children being killed or seriously injured in the train wreck, but 11 African-American women, and I know of 1 child, African-American child, were killed because they were in those front cars. And this one, I think people are searching, looking for people, but they might be cleaning up. I'm not sure what they were exactly doing in this photograph, but they're looking for something. And they could have been picking up like mailbags that had erupted. There was a mail car on the front of the outbound train, and people did collect the mail because it got sent back to a Union Station. But I know that you can just see by the way they're lined up, they're looking for something. And I wish I knew what exactly they were doing. If only photographs could talk. Now this one, when I was talking about the women who were killed, the African American women, I can never keep it clear which boiler was which. But one of the boilers, which looked like this, it might have been this one, but it might have been the one from the other train, at the very end of the day, when they thought that they were finished finding dead bodies, they lifted up the boiler with that crane that I was telling you about, and they found 7 African American men, 5 African American women, and a baby that had been killed by the boiler landing on top of the corner of the car that they were in. And that's what I mean about it being dangerous. It was just right there where, I mean, and that's, you don't even want to think about what that means, because it was very, very, very sad.
Yeah, that's the boiler from the train going into Nashville, so it's probably the other one.
Yeah. And if you look, you can see all those people. If you look real closely on the bridge, those are all people who had come from Nashville to see what was going on. Some of them may have had reason to be there. They may have had loved ones who were on the train, and some were just like the rest of us when we watch CNN, you know, just curious what's going on. So that is the end of my PowerPoint, and we have a lot of time left. So if anybody has any questions, I would be very happy to answer them. I also have one more thing I do want to say, though. I was fortunate enough, with the help of a woman who worked at Fisk University Special Collections, to find what, as far as I know, is the only African American record of what happened at the train wreck at Dutchmans Curve. It was printed in the Chicago Defender on July 20th. I tried to photograph it and get it in there, and it just wouldn't work. But the one thing that this gentleman, he called himself Prince Mysteria. You know, because of the judgments he made in this, he really wouldn't dare put his name on there at that time, because he called the train wreck an act of wholesale murder, and felt that that until the segregation on trains and transportation ended, that these kind of incidents would continue to happen. And that was in 1918, and it was until the 1960s before what he called for in 1918 actually really happened. But if anybody wants to look at it, I won't read it to you because it's pretty lengthy, but I'll have it up here if anybody wants to read it. It's really very interesting. And the language he used, you know, death walked hand in hand with the passengers and crew. I mean, it was just very poetic. I visualize him that he was either a preacher or a lawyer, because he just had a real mastery of words and a real good way of presenting his case. I'm sorry?
You're profiling.
I am profiling. I profiled everybody in this story, yeah. Yeah. So there's a man who's a lawyer here in Nashville. His name is David Ewing. I don't know if any of y'all know David, but his great-grandfather was one of the first African-American lawyers in Nashville, and his name was Prince Albert Ewing. And I kept telling David, this has got to be your grandfather. And he says, you know, if he's going to disguise himself, I doubt if he'd put the word Prince in his name. So, but I really wanted it to be him, but David wouldn't let me make it be him. So it's not. So anyway, does anybody have any questions? Yes, Joe?
The headline, if it's at all accurate, says 121. Mm-hmm. They had 57 injured. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make sense. It would seem like the injured ought to be bigger.
Yeah, the injured turned out to be more like 300. And the official death toll was 101, but I think it was a little higher. but I can't prove it for certain. I have death certificates for about 120 people, but that includes a lot of unknown people whose bodies couldn't be identified. So I don't know if later they were identified and a new death certificate was issued, or, so I really can't say. But as far as what the benefits, death benefits that the railroad paid out, they paid out 99. Because 2 people didn't get, 2 of the people, the railroad engineer and his fireman, were not paid any benefits. They're beneficiaries. So that goes with the 100, and that fits with the 101, and the ICC report, that's the number that they chose to. So it's somewhere between 101 and 120 something. It's still a lot of people.
What was the cause of the wreck?
The wreck was caused by human error. Mr. Kennedy, the engineer of the outbound train, had orders to stop at shops. Does anybody know where the shops were, the railroad shops? They're over by where HCA is now, by Centennial Park. And there was several rows of tracks there, and then they all kind of eventually merged into one track, and then that's the tracks that the incoming train was coming in on. And before that merging, he was supposed to stop and wait for the other train to go by. And for reasons that no one can really figure out right now, he did not do that. And once the, two trains on the same set of tracks, there's nothing that really could be done to stop it. Yes?
Was there any kind of, after this, was there an investigation? I mean, this is a real serious accident. Did the railroad do it?
The Interstate Commerce Commission did it. From the moment of the train wreck to the day that the investigation report was released was 6 weeks. No, it was less. It was, yes, 6 weeks. Nothing like an investigation that would have gone on today. Another interesting thing, when you read the investigation report, they didn't interview any of the passengers. They interviewed 2 people who were working on the train and about 5 or 6 people who weren't working on the train, and they told them what they would have done had they been on the train. So it was kind of an unusual investigation. But they interviewed the conductor and the flagman from the inbound train. And they may have interviewed I may take that back. I think they also interviewed the conductor on the incoming train. So it's like three people who were actually in the wreck, and then the other people were people who were like engineers and conductors that just sort of told, well, this is how we normally do it. And but as far as, but there's no record of them talking to anybody who might have seen the trains go by or anybody who wasn't a passenger. That was a government agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, that did the but they did it in conjunction with people from the NC and St. L Railway and from a company called Nashville Terminals, which is somehow associated with the railroad, and I'm not exactly sure of their relationship, but they were all, those were that was their leaders that were, they also conducted the investigation in conjunction.
They ran the depot downtown and had had some control over the tracks as well.
Oh, okay, all right.
You didn't point out that the federal government was in charge of the railroads at this time under the United States Rail Authority either, so no wonder the federal government didn't investigate it too well, because it was them running the trains.
Yeah.
Are you Linda? No? No? Oh, okay. Is your name Linda? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You had a question?
I did. I read somewhere that the tracks were completely clear by the next day.
Before the next day. They were cleared by 10 o'clock that night. The train, from the night train from Nashville going west left on time around 10 o'clock.
How did they get the cars back on the track to tow them?
they had a, Terry, you want to explain how that worked?
Well, the steam crane that you saw in the illustration, they brought the steam crane out there and some flat cars. They would pick the cars up, put them on the flat car, and then move them back to the shops, which is only a mile and a half back this way down the track. And they took the train, the cars that were not derailed on the Nashville bound train, and moved them probably either to Harding or maybe to Bellevue, and put them on the siding out there and got them out of the way. And then what you saw left, those cars that you see there, that car next to on the right-hand side of the left-hand side of the photograph is off the tracks, but not severely damaged, so it was picked up. The car that's turned over on the upper right there is pretty well demolished, and then there's a car on the other side of that was just absolutely toothpicks. I've done a reconstruction on this thing, and I can't even find the car. It's not there. It's just not there. It was so destroyed. And those boulders, that boulder, and when the trains hit, they went off to the respective right. So that was the engine that was coming toward Nashville. It's off to the right. You're looking back toward Belle Meade there, and back toward Bellevue in that photograph. So you're looking west. That train, that engine has come off to the right. It's on this side, and the other engine is off. If you look at this photograph here, this is the engine that you see in the photograph. You see the steam rising up over it. The other engine is right in that area in there. If you look closely, you can see it down in there. So they left those engines, they left the boulders there until the next morning, and they got them out of the way.
Yeah, the demolished bodies of the locomotives they left there. They had Nashville police and policemen from the DuPont powder plant, and some gentlemen from a group called the Nashville Home Guard. They were night riders, and they patrolled the area to make sure that nobody came in, souvenir seekers or people that just wanted, big hunks of metal, because it was worth a lot. And they did actually rebuild the locomotives and put them back into service. And they ran for about another 30 or more years. So. Yes, sir.
From a writer's point, can you kind of go over your system of research, how you found this stuff, why you wrote the book to start with, and where you found your sources?
Sure. I discovered this story when I was reading a book called I lived in West Nashville. The book was West Nashville, Its People and Its Environs. It was written by a woman named Sarah Foster Kelly, who was she was a descendant of James Robertson, and she lived in West Nashville her whole life, and so she had all this really great source of information. There was like 2 or 3 paragraphs about the train wreck. I'm kind of a historical marker junkie, so when I read it, there was different stories in the book. I'll go see the historical marker about where this happened. Found James Robertson's house, and I found that, but I couldn't find one for the train wreck. And it really bugged me because I was sure there was one. And so I called Metro Historic Commission and talked to a woman named Tara Malnick. And she said, oh, I'm sure we have a marker for that. And then she said, let me see, I'll tell you where it is. And then she came back and says, oh, no, we don't. And we talked a little bit more, and she said, why don't you get us one? We need a marker there. And I thought, well, I've never done that before, but sounds like a fun thing to do. So the next thing I knew, I was out to get a marker for this event, for this incident. And in order to do that, you have to document, like you have to build a proposal, and you have to put some documentation about it. So I started doing some research, and as I was researching it, all these stories just kept coming at me. It was like, they just got more and more fascinating. And so the next thing I knew, I had a marker and I was writing a book. So what took me so long, I started in 2007, and my book, I didn't get my first copy of my book I got in June of 2014. One of the things that took me so long was figuring out whose story I was going to tell and how I was going to tell it. Because I had like 7 boxes about this big of research, and it's boiled down to this. So, like about, I don't know how many thousands of pages, but what really made the story start opening up for me was when I found the death certificates. Because I wanted to know about the people. That's what really was my main interest, was the people who were on the train, and the only way I could figure out to find out who they were was to find their death certificates. So I went to the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and I got the reel for July 1918, started rolling through it, and all of a sudden it was like, killed in train wreck, killed in train wreck, killed in, and it just had all this information about people. And from that moment on, I was really hooked, because all of a sudden there was people with names and occupations and parents and, you know, graves and all kinds of stuff to look at. Okay, somebody back here had a question. Yes.
What about the speed of those trains? Do we know how fast they were going?
It was reported that they were both going about 55 miles an hour, which I think was about maximum speed at that time. Is that wrong, Terry?
That's right. Kennedy hit his emergency brake, but the other engineer didn't, so maybe one of them slowed down a little bit, but by the time they saw each other, they were still getting pretty close to 55.
So, so they call that a combined speed of 110, which sounds, which is a lot more powerful, I guess. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Betsy Lewis will ask.
Hi, Lewis. If I had my glasses on, I probably would have recognized you.
Is your book out?
Yes.
Do you say how much per body, so to speak, how much recovery was gotten by each person?
Oh, yes. I don't have those figures exactly memorized, but it's roughly an average. If you were white, the average, you're asking a good question. I know you already know the answer to it too. But the average, it was for a white person who was killed, the average was $7,000, and the average paid to African American casualties, their beneficiaries, was $1,100. So there was a big disparagement there. Yes, ma'am.
Why were two not given any kind of settlement?
They were determined to have been responsible for causing the accident. It was the engineer, David Kennedy, and Mr. Kelly, Luther Meadows, his fireman. They were in the cab of the outbound train, and they should have waited. So they were blamed. They were blamed. And that's what the second part of my book is about. The first part of my book is the day of the wreck, tells sun up to sundown what I know to be fact, combined with me trying to give everybody a little bit of humanity. So I kind of imagined a few things, like what it smelled like or what it looked like, and from sun up to sundown on July 9th, 1918. And then the second part of the book is a court trial where Mr. Kennedy's wife tries to prove that he was not responsible. Yes?
The African Americans who were going to work at the munitions factory, where were they coming from? Were there many stops? Were there, I know they're coming from the West, but... 128
people were hired in Memphis on Monday, July 8th to go to work at the munitions plant. It had just opened up on July 1st. And so 128 people were hired. They got on the night train. They boarded the train Monday night about 8 o'clock. But they were hired that morning. They were from Shelby County, Little Rock, Arkansas, the Mississippi Delta area right there, like Hernandez, all that real close to Memphis, that area. Yes, sir.
In your book, you have a Mr. Ferris that died in the train wreck. Mm-hmm. I'm married to somebody who's kin to the Ferris family. And the story goes that the settlement that Mr. Ferris got went to his son, who was Frank Ferris, and he used that money to start Third National Bank. So I think that's a interesting story that came out of that.
That is, some of the people in the Ferris family don't agree with that story, so I kind of...
Don't agree with it?
They don't agree with it, so I kind of stay away from that. They asked me not to pass that on, to not, that's not...
I want you to put that in the book.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so, and we looked at the numbers, $7,000 really wasn't enough to start a bank. Divided by 4 brothers,
How about a life insurance policy?
I'm sure there was life insurance. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of and I think that's one reason why there was such a big difference in, because they look at how much people make. There were some prominent people that were killed in the train wreck that were white, so they probably got quite a bit more than the average farmer who was white. Their settlement was probably closer to what most of the African Americans got, is what I'm thinking. There might have been some people like Mr. Ferris who might have got quite a bit more than $7,000 because his earning, they had the, I can't remember what it was called, but it was an actuary table that they just looked at and they figured out, how much everybody would get by how old you were, how much more you would probably earn in your lifetime, and so.
How long did it take them to get paid?
Very quickly. There was notices in both the Memphis and the Nashville newspaper not to hire, and it was interesting, they called them ambulance chasers, not to hire a lawyer or an ambulance chaser, because they would only take most of your money when it was already determined by the government how much you were going to get. So just show up at such and such place at such and such time. And I think some people probably just agreed to take whatever it took to get their loved one's body back home, So I think it went very quickly. There was I don't think, except for the people who were blamed, I don't think there was any argument about, And it wasn't like you're going to get more if you asked for more. So, somebody back here had a question. Yes, sir.
Dutchmans Curve, where did the name come from originally?
The name Dutchmans Curve, also Dutchman's Bend, and Dutchman's Grade. Those were 3 names of places that along that set of tracks were named in honor of the German rock cutters who were brought by the Nashville Northwestern Railroad in the 1850s to carve out that set of tracks. When the German workers arrived in Nashville and they introduced themselves to the local people, they said they were Dutchmen. And somehow that got confused with Dutchman, and they were so the tracks were named that area was named in honor of them, and the name Dutchman stuck in it, so. And I think that I've talked to other people who are Dutch, and they say that happens a lot in other parts of the country where something was actually German and it'll be named Dutch because they sound so similar to an untrained ear. Anybody else have any more questions? Yes, sir.
What was the communication for the trains? Was it light or just signals to drop down and let them know to pass?
The main thing that they were supposed to go by were their orders. You were given orders before you left, and and the order, and you were to follow what was written in your order. There was nothing that this is what I learned as I researched this, nothing overrode a train order, short of another train order. But there was also a semaphore that had communications within the shops area, but those communications were only for while you were within the shops area. They didn't override your orders, and that's what was kind of confusing because the semaphore was set clear, like it was clear for the train coming from Nashville to proceed, but that really meant it was only clear for it to proceed through the shops. They didn't have permission it wasn't giving the train permission to go further. Yes, sir?
Is it true that there was a switch engine that went through there shortly before that time with some empty cars, and they thought that someone took it as, thought that was the train that they were supposed to be waiting for from Memphis?
It is true that a train went through there, or as Mr. Eubanks said in court, something with steam went by. because he said he didn't look up. He just saw the steam. He said something with steam went by. But whether Mr. Kennedy mistook that for the incoming train, we'll never know. But that does, that is one of the thoughts that perhaps that is why he, why he went out, is he thought the train had gone by. But when you're an engineer of a train, and anybody that's been with me while I've researched this knows I was on a mission to clear Mr. Kennedy's name, and I was not able to do that. And any engineer would know that you don't just think a train went by, you make sure. So.
How many cars were on the incoming train from Memphis?
Okay, I believe there was 2 Jim Crow cars, 3 what they called regular cars, and 2 Pullman sleepers. So 3, 2, like 7. Oh, and a baggage car. And I may have that wrong. There may have only been 2 regular cars. 7? 7's right? Okay. Yes, Ken?
Did the railroad change anything after this? Procedures, they change any kind of procedure? They do anything to possibly avert another one of these?
Well, one of the railroad documents that I read said that as long as the government was running the railroad company itself was not going to make any changes. But once the government turned the running operations of the trains back over to the railroad, like in 1923 or 1922, I think, changes started happening pretty quickly. They started replacing some of the wooden cars. They improved their signal system, and eventually by the 1940s they did the NC and St. L Railway did a curve reduction, which included Dutchmans Curve, and after that curve reduction they were determined the safest railroad of its class in the United States of America. So I believe that they made an effort to improve safety.
Signaling was not, it was still dark territory in 1942. They started in Atlanta, started putting signals up through Chattanooga to here, all the way down to Memphis.
Okay, so I guess I'm wrong on that point. Yeah. Okay.
You're not entirely wrong. It's just they never got around to putting the signals up until 1942, 43.
Okay.
Did this get a lot of national attention?
For a little while, like a day or two. I've read Omaha, Nebraska, New York Times, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle. Those are the 4 papers that I have copies of where they covered it. But what they did is, it was like they had the Associated Press at that time, and it was pretty much the same article that ran in the Banner. There was, like they just sent it off. They don't now. And then the Chicago Defender, but of course they ran a different kind of article. They also ran the one that was in the Banner. That came out like a couple days afterwards. Within about a week or so later, they got this article from Prince Mysteria and ran it. And it was so. But they were the voice. The Chicago Defender was the African American paper of the times, and they were the voice of the people, and they reported on anything that they felt was discriminatory in the South.
Was there a reason why it took so long after the end of World War I for the railroads to regain control of their tracks?
I don't really know the answer to that, except for that maybe it was just a paperwork thing. I really don't know for sure why it took so long. Like laws had to be passed, and
The railroads were not taken over as a War Powers Act. It was actually more of an anti-monopoly act. The federal government thought they could run the railroad better than the private companies. Gee, does that sound familiar to today, huh?
yes, sir. Lewis.
Yeah, I'd like to pontificate a little bit here.
Okay.
There was, at that time, a law still in existence, known as the Federal Employers Liability Act. Federal Employers Liability Act, FELA. The law has absolutely nothing to do with federal employees or anything. It's a complete misnomer. It only applies to businesses that are engaged in interstate commerce. In other words, it only applies to railroads, okay? And what happened was that Kennedy and the other guy got lawyers, the wives got lawyers, and they litigated a FELA case, all right? And as you correctly pointed out to me, which I didn't know, they won their case at the trial level, okay, at the hearing, the lawsuit in the federal court here. And I think Kennedy's widow got $21,000 or something like that number. And then, as you pointed out to me when we happened to get in the library together, the case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in a one-page opinion, the great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said no, okay, and he reversed.
Very harshly.
Very harshly. And you know, I was absolutely stunned, you know, when you showed me that. And so here he is, this great legal thinker, jurist, and so forth. And he was so pro-railroad, okay, that railroad employees just couldn't get a break, okay, as long as he was.
He called it a perversion of the law if they were to give him Mrs. Kennedy any money.
I should explain something about FELA. FELA is not a workers' compensation law as you and I in this room know it, okay? Basically what it is a hybrid law. And the way it works is that if you are a railroad employee injured on the job, as these two guys were killed, if you could show that the railroad was negligent, okay, and the negligence caused your death, then you got a recovery. And that is what the widow Kennedy and so forth tried to show with the confusing signals of flagman and this, that, and so forth. And typically in a FELA case, if you have fairly sophisticated jurors, or any sophisticated jurors, they can quickly pick up on the fact that for the widow to get any money, we're going to have to pin the liability on the railroad, not on the railroad worker, okay? And as I said, they did. Okay, they had skilled lawyers, and everything was fine until Justice Holmes got the fine.
Well, Louis, what I don't know if I discussed this with you or not, but my thoughts on that were that what you're saying about the jury, like what Terry just said about how people felt about the government running the railroad, the jury probably felt really good to say, sure, let's give this lovely deaf widow some money because, you know, we're kind of like in the face of the government. We're not slamming our beloved Nashville's railroad. You know, they weren't really blaming the railroad, they were blaming the government. And I think that made it a little bit easier for them to come up with the verdict that, you know, that the railroad was responsible. I wonder if the railroad, if it had actually been the NC and St. L Railway, I don't know that the juries, because the way people loved the railroad, loved that railroad company, if they would have found in her favor if it had been them running the railroad at the time.
Two little follow-up points. Follow-up point number one is that the money, okay, for the lives actually came from the federal government. It did not come from the railroads. In fact, there was an indemnity provision when the government took over the railroads that the deal was, you know, we, the U.S. government, will be liable for any, you know, losses of cars, locomotives, and so forth. And the second thing is, one of the reasons there wasn't very much talk about it or very much news coverage and so forth is because they were still concerned about sabotage. Okay, you know, World War I ended abruptly, and at that time it was going great guns, and there was worry, there was concern that, oh dear, the train had been sabotaged, which on its way to the powder plant.
And I do believe that that was a concern, because one of the first people who was called out to the site was a gentleman named Charles Ridley, who was the leader of that organization I mentioned earlier, the Nashville Home Guard. And part of their job was, number one, to terrorize slackers, and which is what we call draft dodgers. But another one, part of their job was to check bridges, railroad crossings, and tunnels for sabotage. So I think the fact that he was one of the first people called out there, I think that was, you know, it was a bridge, it was a railroad, and there wasn't a tunnel. But I do think that thought did cross people's mind right away, that it might have been an act of sabotage. But I think that was clearly not the case. Did we answer everybody's questions?
Are the unidentified people buried like in mass grave here in Nashville?
You know, that I don't know. One of the first things I did when I got my list of names is I visited as many graves as I could. I went to the Jewish cemetery, I went to Calvary, I went to Mount Olivet. Mount Olivet and Calvary have, there's 2 at Calvary and about 28 at Mount Olivet. There's some in Spring Hill that I wasn't able to find. And I went to Green Hill where it says on the death certificates that most of either the African Americans were either sent home back, it says, you know, picked up and returned to Memphis or returned to Little Rock. But a lot of them said that they were buried in Green Hill. And I went there with David Ewing, and we were unable to, we went through the books, and it ended in, the book for July 1918 was missing. So it ended in like June 1918 and picked back up in like August of 1919 or something. So we weren't able to find any of the graves. Now, Mr. Hall, whose photograph I showed you, he was buried in Spring Hill, but I wasn't able to find his grave. Did that answer? But someone just told me the other day that there's a, I met this woman, Ralph, the woman we met the other night at McKay's, Gretchen from Pegram, and she said that there's a mass grave in Pegram because there was 9 people from Pegram, Kingston Springs, and Newsom Station, that area, that were killed. And she said that she's only lived in the community about 10 years, but she said that she has had people tell her that there was a mass grave, and she was going to see if she could find out where it was. Are we finished?
The incoming train stopped at Pegram, didn't it?
It did. Well, no. I always thought it did, but it's the last scheduled stop that the train made was in Dixon. And then from Dixon, it was considered an express from Dixon. That particular run was an express from Dixon to Nashville. I always thought it stopped in Dixon, Kingston Springs, Pegram, Bellevue, and Vaughn's Gap, but I was wrong.
Why were there so many people from Pegram on it? Did they go away?
Most of them were domestic workers going to work.
But if they didn't stop at Pegram, where would they have gone?
They probably would have. That's a good question. They might have been going home. They might have been on another train going home, or they may have been picked up in Dixon. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, because there are people from Bellevue and all those areas, but the train hadn't stopped there. But they could have been on the train going out that would have been taking them home, which is what I found out about the 3 relatives from Kingston Springs. In Pegram, there was 2 brothers, 2 African-American brothers that were killed. And from Kingston Springs, there was 2 brothers and a cousin that were killed. They were on their way home. They were domestic workers, and Tuesday was their day off, and they were going home for the day. And they were their mothers were sisters and their fathers were brothers. So they were like, was that double cousins? And I just think that was such a, for that family, that was just a terrible, terrible thing to lose 3 people like that all in one day. I think we've tapped the questions. Hope I didn't ramble on too long.